ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to Jonathan Wareham, ESADE, and the organising committee for this invitation to come to CERN, come from CERN to speak to you today. My apologies on behalf of Sergio Bertolucci. Enjoyed very much the fruit. And so I hope I can stand in for him and show you a little bit about what we're doing at CERN, why we need such a computing infrastructure, and how we think we're going to evolve it in the future. What is CERN, first of all? Well, you've probably all heard about it, being on the news with the startup of the Lhc and so on. But it's sort of Europe's first major research organisation that was formed after the Second World War. So in 1954, it started with, at the time, 12 member states, and I'm pleased to say we continue to grow. We now have 20 member states. You can see them listed on there. And a number of other members are coming along. Also, I should say that our Council and Director General recently changed the underlying mandate of CERN as well. So it's not just a European centre anymore, it's now a global centre. And we have direct interest from Brazil, India, Russia, and so on to become full members of CERN as well. So it's really taking on its sort of global aspects. In terms of size, it's really quite modest in terms of the number of people working at CERN, just 2,300, 2,400. But those personnel are added to by about another 700, 800 people, students, PhD students, associates and so on, all working on the site. Now we have a budget of about 1 billion Swiss francs. So a Swiss franc is, it's 1.2 Swiss francs to the euro, so it gives you a rough estimate of roughly the size of the budget. And it's all paid by the member states, a fixed rate out of the GDP of each of the countries that contribute to CERN. So I'm pleased to say it's continuing to grow and the work we do there. So not only do we serve the member states, but we serve a global community all around. And this chart from June of last year shows you roughly where the users making use of the physics facilities at CERN come from. So you see the member states, but observer states, and a large number from other countries as well. Since CERN isn't very closed in that sense, we publish all of our results. Our scientific results are made public to everybody. We do not restrict them purely to the member states or things like that. But what do we do? Well, why are we there? Well, basically, physics has a standard model at the moment, which tries to explain the theory of how matter came into existence, the relationships and forces that hold the various particles together. But it's only a theory. And as Jonathan said as well, CERN is all about not just theory, but experimenting and proving that that theory is correct. And we use our accelerators and physics infrastructures to do just that. So the sort of questions we're looking at is how to explain that particles have mass. Where does that come from? You've heard about the Higgs. Is this the origin of it? We'd like to be able to say that we've seen the Higgs and hence demonstrate that it's consistent with this standard model. 96% of the universe is invisible to us in terms of dark matter. Why is that? Where does it come from? Again, various experiments, not only at the Lhc, but other physics infrastructures at CERN are looking into those questions as well. Why isn't there antimatter in the universe? It should be symmetric, 50-50, but thankfully it isn't, otherwise it will be annihilated. What is that difference? Where does that come from as well? And CERN as well is pretty much like a time machine in the sense that with the accelerators that we have, the more powerful they are, the further we can go back into approximately the 13 billion years that the universe is said to exist. We can get closer and closer. So it allows us, with the Lhc, to get just to a few instants, supposedly after the Big Bang, and look at the state of matter as it existed then. And the more we can investigate that, the better we can understand the state of our world today. And this is our playground. So this is where we bring together the theory and the experimentation. What you see there in yellow is the trace of the underground tunnel of the Lhc. It was built in the 80s for our previous accelerator called the LEP, but we dismantled that when it's at the end of its useful life and replaced it with the Lhc accelerator in the same tunnel. But It's not the only accelerator. We have a whole generation of them, the SPS, the PS, and so on. These are still faithful machines still running and acting as injectors to the LHC. And on the accelerator itself, we have a number of experiments that are sitting at different points around the accelerator. So those are our detectors. That's where the experiments are actually taking data and understanding what's happening. So if we look at it in more detail, that's a little cutaway of what the accelerator looks like, those famous blue magnets. There's about 1,200 of them stretching for 27 kilometers around the machine. And then there are 4 major experiments on the accelerator at the moment. ATLAS and CMS are the largest and more general purpose ones. ALICE and LHCb are more looking at precise measurements for different characteristics of physics. So an analogy you can use is what CERN does is we operate basically a racetrack, which is the accelerator, and we have competing teams that come and build experiments sitting on that racetrack and competing to understand as best they can the physics that underlying the fundamentals of our world today. If you look in more detail at the accelerator, this is a cutaway, one of those magnets in there. What you can see inside it are the 2 beam lines. So what the accelerator does are we actually accelerate particles of beams around the accelerator in opposite directions. And they are brought to collide at the points where the experiments are situated. So we perform collisions between those 2 beams at the experiment sites. Now, of course, this is rather complicated to do because it's actually going around at approximately 50 nanoseconds is the time it takes to go around the accelerator at the moment. After our next shutdown, which will start in January of 2013 and come back up in 2014, that time will reduce to half. So it will be going around 25 nanoseconds. So it means it will be happening, we're having collisions 40 million times per second. So you can start to imagine sort of data rates are associated with that as that builds up. And of course, to do this, we have to use superconductivity to be able to accelerate at these rates. And to do that, we used fluid helium to actually cool all this material. And so that part, the core part of this machine, is operating about minus 273 centigrade. So almost as close to absolute zero as we can get, and colder than outer space. It takes us about 3 months to cool down the whole accelerator in 8 segments. So if one of the engineers forgets his keys in there, it takes us 3 months to go in and get his keys, and 3 months to bring it back again as well. So we have to be very careful what we do from an operational point of view. Looking at experiments, they've taken their big enterprises in their own rights. And this photograph was taken about 2005. So a few years ago, during the construction. This is part of the ATLAS experiment. Just to give you an idea, you can see a man sitting there at the bottom, give you an idea of the scale. So this is the whole thing that's been filled in, just the outer parts. It's completely full of electronics inside it as well now. And that experiment is about 7 stories tall in terms of a building, and it's sitting in the bottom of a cavern approximately 100 meters below ground. So building it was really an engineering feat. It's a bit like trying to construct a ship in a bottle, lowering all the various parts that you see there down a shaft of 100 meters long into this cavern, put it in place, and construct the whole thing. But from an IT point of view, which is what we're interested in here today, it represents about 150 million sensors. And so it will generate data at 40 million times per second. So in a simplistic view, essentially it's extremely high precision, very detailed digital camera. And it will take 40 million photographs per second. Right? So now you start to understand why the data processing aspects of the data coming from these machines has been a major concern for CERN during the startup of LHC. And remember, that's just one of them. So it's a petabyte per second. And we have 4 of those. Yeah? This graphic shows you basically what's happening. Remember, I said we have the circulating beams of particles going around. Imagine this could be the ATLAS or the CMS detector. So here we see the beams coming together. They collide at the middle of the experiment. And out of that comes a whole array of particles. And what we have to do is capture the different characteristics of those particles. So the detector is a bit like an onion ring. As you cut through the onion ring, each ring looks for a different aspect of it. Looks for the velocity, looks for the magnetic charge, all different aspects of the particle. And there we have dedicated electronics which detect those movements of the particles and the characteristics of them, and takes it off behind a concrete wall to the baseline computer data acquisition systems that are sitting at the base of those experiments as well. So we have a number of triggering layers inside each of the experiments. They're not all identical. Remember, they're competing, so they have different approaches, different technologies. But overall, this is what they look like. So we have the first level trigger here, which tends to be custom-built electronics, which was designed approximately a decade ago now. And we don't tend to use full-scale operating systems there because they're not deterministic. The time from starting, having some event being triggered to the actual code you want executed is not fully deterministic with most schedulers and so on. So there's stripped-down systems inside here. And what we only see at this time is a bit like keyhole surgery. With this rate of data coming in at that time, the amount of time we have to look at each event, we cannot look at the whole picture, if you want. We can only look at a few key points of the picture, and with that, we have to make a decision of whether or not we're going to keep that picture. Are we going to keep that event or throw it away because we've already seen it? So we make some decisions there, and then the data of that event or photograph are passed on to higher level triggers. Now, these start to look, even in the graphics, more like the type of standard servers and PCs that you're used to seeing. And that's very much the case. We tend to use commodity machines at that level. We're fortunate in the physics world in the sense that each one of these events or photographs can be processed independently. There's no necessary relationship between one event and the other, which means that we can process it essentially in an embarrassingly parallel style. So we can farm out each of those events individually to different machines. Okay? So we tend to have rather major clusters at each of those experiments, typically around about 3,000 servers sitting there processing the data that comes out there. And again, it reduces the number of events we take, but we have more time for each event, so it means we can run more complex algorithms, we can look at more of the photograph, and we can make better decisions about whether or not we're going to keep that data or we're going to throw it away. So basically, the whole point of this is to decide what parts of the data we have to keep and which we have to throw away. Now, this is not unique to physics. As new research infrastructures get built around the world, you probably saw the recent announcement about the Square Kilometre Array, which is going to be built in Australasia and Southern Africa jointly. The data rates for the Square Kilometre Array, when it becomes fully operational in place, will be larger than the LHC. So a lot of the ideas and technologies that are being built for the LHC are equally valid for those types of future research infrastructures as well. So what I explained to you is happening down at these points on the accelerator. Then we have fiber optic cables taking it up to the surface, and from there as well, there's more data processing here. Fiber optic cables to CERN's major computer center, which is located on the CERN campus. Inside the data center, it's a major data center in its own right. We have about 8,000 servers there processing and storing the data. We still use as well tape technology. You might be surprised, but we use that because in terms of the type of access we have to the data, it turns out that tape currently is still the most cost-effective for us in terms of the amount of storage we get per euro, if you want. So we use a lot of tape storage there. The other good thing about tape is it's green. It's not like a disk. You're not using electricity to turn the spindles. So when you're not reading the data, it's not in the drive, you're not consuming electricity. Okay? Electricity is a major issue for us. We have about 2.5 megawatts of power accessible inside our data center. And like many commercial enterprises now, we have hit the energy barrier. We are not allowed to bring any more electricity into our data center. So we're doing a lot of work to understand, can we change the technologies that we're using in the data center? Can we improve the efficiency, the PUE ratio of the data center? Can we reduce the amount of energy we need above what's being consumed for the data processing itself? And also, we've just commissioned a second data center via open tendering process. We had responses from more than 25 centers around Europe, any of the member states, And finally, a center was chosen in Hungary. So we'll have a second remote data center in Hungary, which will also help us in terms of business continuity. In case the CERN data center were to burn down, we have a second data center elsewhere as well. Our switching capacity is extremely high as well, because as you'll see in a moment, CERN is not alone in processing this data. So if you look for the process, everything I've explained to you at the moment is all about the data acquisition. So that's all what happens at the experiment site, pulling that data out. In parallel, of course, we have to compare it. We have simulation. We use Monte Carlo simulations to understand and predict what we would expect to see in those experiments as well. And of course, these two are constantly used in terms of calibration work as well. So this actually generates this uses a lot more CPU time than one would imagine. We use more CPU time here, but less data, because we're generating it rather than taking it from the machine. Of course, with that, we have to do reconstruction. So we have to reconstruct all those particle paths and so on inside the data from the raw data that's coming out. We have to build up those images, those pictures again, if you want, with the key characteristics in it. And there we do it with a reduced data set. We don't go back again to the full data set, the raw data, but we have a reduced summary data, and that's what the physicists tend to work with afterwards. And then we have the analysis part as well. That's what all the physicists are interested in. There are thousands of them sitting around the world just waiting with the keys, hands on the keyboards, waiting to get that physics data, because they want to be the person that understands it the best. They want to be the person that gets the Nobel Prize. So we have to make sure this whole chain happens as quickly as possible, and that we can move the data out and give them the most capacity possible to try out all their different theories and ideas about how best to interpret that data. Just to give you an example from one experiment last year, for the total data taken, for the Atlas experiment, one of the larger ones, there are about 300 billion interactions, so collisions, if you want, inside the experiment. And we recorded 1.6 billion events for that single experiment. So we're really looking for a needle in a haystack. And it really comes down to statistics in the end, at looking at all of those events together. But this machine will be running for 20 years. All right? So each year it was predicted that we would take about 15 petabytes, need to store about 15 petabytes of data per year. And if we're going to store that data, if you're silly enough to try and write it on DVDs, which we don't, it would be about 3 million DVDs that we would need to actually record all that data. And we need about 100,000 PCs to process it to keep up with the data rates. Surprisingly enough, maybe because of Moore's law as well, that number seems to remain pretty constant. Of course, as the latest, we work a lot with Intel architectures, the latest generations come along, we still stay at about 100,000 machines, but the point is that physicists always want more and more. It's an insatiable appetite. The more we can produce, the happier they are. And CERN itself can only accommodate about 20% of that capacity. We don't have it all. And the member states didn't want to give us the money to do it all at CERN. So we have to come up with another model which will allow us to actually process this stuff in a global rate and keep it all together. And the way we did that was we're looking around, and we're working with Ian Foster and Carl Kasserman, who were sort of from Argonne University and Southern California. And we started investigating the use of grid technology and a grid approach for distributed computing. And this is the model after several simulations that we put in place for the LHC, I would say over the last 10 years. So in this graphic, what you see, that's CERN at the center there, tier 0 we call it. And around that we have 11 tier 1 centers, major data centers around the world. Majority of them in different European states. There's one here in Spain, here in Barcelona. There's one in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands. Also, of course, there's a distributed one across the Scandinavian countries, one in the UK at Rutherford, and then 2 in the US, 1 in Canada, and 1 in Asia as well. And we have put in place dedicated high-speed links to those major data centers. And they perform an important function in the sense that they have major computing capacity as well, but also they store a copy of the data for us. So we're guaranteed we have at least 2 copies of the data somewhere out there in the internet structure at any one time, again for a question of business continuity, but also in terms of giving access to the end users. Each one of those 11 data centers in turn serves 20 to 30 other data centers on a regional basis. So serving the data to them and providing support on an operational point of view. So the point I said here is the fact that it's all done in sort of a contributory basis. There's no money exchanging hands here between CERN and these centers that you see around there. What it is, there's a memorandum of understanding of the different organizations that are contributing to the experiments, and they say they're also going to contribute so much storage capacity, so much compute capacity, and network capacity as well. And we keep track of that. And we sort of use social approach to that as well. In a sense, we have a sort of a name and shame and a hall of fame. So we can see what's the status and behavior of any one of those centers at any one time, real time. You can go online, you can just Google for it, and you'll see the status of those centers. And that's helped very much in terms of pushing up the availability and reliability. And so this system has been running now for about 3 or 4 years continuously. We've had network dropouts, we've had fires at data centers and stuff, but it still keeps running continuously, despite things like earthquakes and so on. It continues to run because of the built-in redundancy from the number of centers available, the network links, and the capacity that's available inside it. As I said, we have the network infrastructure. We use the National Research Educational Networks in Europe, linked together with the GEON project. Same thing with ESNet in the US and other links to Asia as well. And this is a key point. And this is one of the things that in the simulation that we did around about the year 2000 to understand what sort of data model we would use, we assumed that networking would be the weakest link. And it's turned itself it's turned on its head in a sense now. It turns out that the networking is actually the most reliable link that we have, wide area networking. It's also the thing that's improved in terms of capacity and availability against price far better than the storage and the CPU aspects as well. So we're changing our architecture now. It's becoming less of a hierarchy and more of a flat network connectivity point of view, where it's not only going to be connectivity between CERN, the tier 1s and then the tier 2s, but more direct contacts between the tier 2 centers, other tier 1s, and so on. So it's becoming a little bit more, if you want, democratic. I would not use this term peer-to-peer because there are other connotations, but it is going more in that direction because of the evolution of the technology and because of the evolution of what's available commercially on the networking business side of things. In terms of the amount of data, so we recorded 22 petabytes of data last year. It will be more this year, we know already. The physicists are great at producing more data. Remember, they're trying to understand their machines as well. And essentially, you can imagine it like they've got some dials on it, and they can change the trigger rate that they have for the different detectors and increase or reduce the amount of data. And of course, if we show we have the capacity, they have fantastic ways of finding ways of filling it and using it. So it's an unending request of the amount of capacity and data we have. And we're running at the moment with about, we measure something called hepspec in terms of hours per month, but we're running with equivalent to about 150,000 CPUs across those data centers at the moment. And it continues to grow. And it won't stop even when the machine is shut down, because we will do reprocessing, simulation, and other work as well. And it's worked pretty much around the world. We weren't really convinced about this model with the tier 2s at the start. We knew tier 1, CERN, would be fine. We knew the tier 0 and the tier 1s would be fine. That seemed like a reasonable number you could manage, 11 tier 1s and 1 major data center. But having 150 data centers, which are the ones involved in LHC, not the total ones in the grid, 150 of them, we weren't convinced that was going to work. But it turns out, in fact, much to everybody's surprise, that the tier 2s are actually the major source of the compute resources in the infrastructure. And here are some of the results. This is what happens. They analyze the data, and they reproduce these sort of event displays. This is one event from an experiment, so you can understand the work that has to go on to disambiguate all the different particle tracks that are inside of a single event. But this is the sort of thing that happens, the reconstruction of this data. And as a result of that, we get some physics results out and published. The great thing is that we are able to take that data from CERN, have it stored, recorded, pushed out to the tier 1 centers, and hence from them to the tier 2s in a matter of hours. So we're able to get results and sort of publications coming out as well. And one thing that might scare you, of course, when we're dealing with experiments of this side, is authors. And if you look on the Atlas paper, there are 13 pages of authors just on the list. And this is a problem we have. How do we do this? But we have to handle it somehow. There are actually separate secretariats for each of those experiments, and they keep track of who is on that experiment. I worked for 10 years on the Atlas experiment, and I'm not the only R. Jones that exists on that experiment, as you can imagine. But they managed to disambiguate me and realize that I'm not the R. Jones that's on the latest papers. So they're actually doing quite a good job there as well. I said this infrastructure is used for physics, but it's not only used for physics, it's used for other aspects as well. These are all the other sciences that have worked with CERN and the physics community over the last decade in building this grid infrastructure. And we've been working very closely with the European Commission through a number of European Commission co-funded projects and with our colleagues at DOE and NSF in the US. Both sides, the physics community, both sides of the Atlantic, working together to get those things going. And the major ones that are using at the moment, I'd say life sciences. There is the other major use of that infrastructure today in terms of the amount of resources consumed. Typically in the areas such as drug discovery, genome analysis, and so on as well. Then also computational chemistry has very high computational needs, and they're making very high use of the infrastructure as well. All the other fields, of course, are also using it as well. And it's sort of, again, as a collaborative basis. And we're seeing how that will evolve in the future. But still, it is dominated by high-energy physics in terms of total capacity, because as well, it's the physics centres which are contributing their resources in there. It's a bit like a Canadian dinner. Everybody brings a dish, and you can taste from everybody's dish. Okay? But, you know, what is that collaboration, the LHC collaboration? Well, it's the resources, as I said, are distributed and provided in kind. There's no money changing hands there. But it's really a managed service. The people working at those infrastructures, those data centers around the world, keep it operating 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And that's very important. But this is one of the things we want to change. The model, as far as we're concerned, is quite expensive in terms of operational manpower. And we're trying to see now, how can we reduce that operational manpower? And in terms of implementation, well, it's the grid technology, which you're probably well aware of. But how can we evolve that as well? And so we want to keep the whole model, but evolve the implementation of it, take into account the latest developments. So if you put it in a graphical means, this is what it looks like, the collaboration with the coordination, the management, the requirements, the memorandum of understanding that links everything together. Then there's the framework in terms of the services that are offered there, the data services, and one very, very important point as well is the security aspects are in there as well. We have a shared public key infrastructure based on X509 certificates, which means that any physicist registered with any of the experiments participating in LHC has access to any of those centers anywhere in the world. So they can make use of any of those resources using one login, one identity. Okay? And that's very important to us. That took a lot of time to put in place. And you don't find that at the moment if you look at cloud computing. Different aspects of it, it's not there now. You can't have a federated identity management system across all the different commercial cloud systems at the moment. It's here now in the grid system. And if we're going to move to use some of these technologies, we'd like to see those things exist in the future for there as well. That's put in place by, there are national certificate authorities in each of the countries which you're coming from. You can go and request to have a certificate which will give you access to the infrastructure once you've been authenticated and authorized to do it. So what we're looking at actually really is how can we change these aspects at the bottom? And what we're looking at is taking away sort of like, let's say there's the collaborative model, the grid model, but can we make use of some of the technologies that are coming up for virtualization? And can we share it somehow between a private infrastructure and a public infrastructure? Can we put those two aspects together? Can we marry academic centers and commercial centers to put it together, to expand on the resources? Because as I said, the physicists will consume what's ever available. How can we increase those things in the future? So these are sort of some of the aspects that we're looking at now. In terms of data management and access, we keep going over the question, do you move the data to the compute or do you move the compute to the data? And there are lots of different discussions going on about that, given the evolution of networking capacity, given the evolution of an existence now of commercial data centers, what's the best way of doing it? Also looking at the nature of our data, its characteristics, what's the best way of doing it? At the moment, the experiments are actively involved in something called data placement. They have their favorite data centers around, and they try to place the data with those major data centers. But they don't all do it the same. Remember, they're competing as well. And how do you make reliable and fault-tolerant systems out of unreliable and not so tolerant components? At CERN's experience, we see the most unreliable components we have are disks and power supplies, right? It's an amazing number of disks we get through every year and have to be replaced, yeah? So how do you build up the whole architecture that takes that into account as well? There is a general movement in fundamental research that if it's funded by the public should have access. We have to put policies in place for that and make that possible. How could we put the infrastructure in place where millions of people can have access to that data? One has to think about a different order of magnitude to what we're doing today. And then adapt to changing technologies. A lot of this software was written when there was single core, perhaps dual core, now sort of many core processors. But at the moment, we're probably only using a fraction of those cores in reality, and I'm sure most of you are as well. But if we want to get the most power out of these machines, we have to parallelize our software. And we have rather large software stacks, and it's not always evident. The programming skills necessary to parallelize such complicated software is not always so evident, and it requires a sort of a high learning process and a lot of manpower to redo that. Then a global file system-like facilities. We would love Dropbox on a global scale that could hold the LHC data. Doesn't exist yet. But we'd like to be able to do that, but we're seeing how we can sort of make use of those different things. Virtualization. It's great, but it has to be reasoned as well. You're not going to virtualize all aspects of the data center. We found that already at CERN. So what aspects are ripe for virtualization, and which ones should we leave as they are at the moment? And again, as I said, the networking infrastructure proves to be one of the most reliable elements. So we're doing this in collaboration with industry, and how we try to get over the sort of the valley of death at CERN between, which is the same for all fundamental research, between fundamental research and industrialization, is we're trying to use models such as the Cern Open Lab, where it's a partnership between CERN and these major companies that you see here. And it's been going for over 10 years, so we must be doing something right with them because they keep coming back and funding it. But really what we do is, we had this term that my predecessor used. He said, you make it, we break it. And we're very good at breaking things at CERN. So we're very good at breaking Oracle's databases, blowing it out of scale, completely busting the number of columns you can put in a table. Intel processors, making them burn. We're very good at doing that as well and blowing those ones out as well. HP, we do a lot of networking with them. Also on Wi-Fi. How to turn Wi-Fi deployment from a sort of a dark art into a science. We have examples at CERN where we've been looking for months trying to understand why on a regular basis the Wi-Fi was not available in a particular floor and particular offices until somebody had the bright idea of charting that against when the lift was going up and down. And of course, as the lift goes up, it blocks the access. And then you find out, oh yes, now why isn't this known already? Why isn't this part of the techniques when you deploy Wi-Fi? Why aren't those things taken into account? And with Siemens, we do the control systems as well for the accelerator itself and the detectors. You can imagine the number of PLCs that are used on a machine of this scale, making sure they're secure, making sure that we don't have the equivalent of Stuxnet that affects CERN and so on. You can imagine those things coming up as well. And with Weiwei, we're looking at new sort of data processing approaches, technologies. How can we work with technologies like Hadoop and so on, MapReduce approach to looking at our data. And we do a lot of research, we do a lot of training and dissemination and outreach. The companies actually fund PhD students and so on that work on this stuff with us. And we publish the results and give back improvements on the technologies to the manufacturers. And they, of course, what they get out of it is they get improved products, and they can also use CERN as a sort of public success story, which helps them sell their materials to other industries as well. The other area we're looking at cloud computing is looking with other major sciences as well. So CERN, we've taken part of the simulation step that's being done with the ATLAS experiment, and we've ported that out to see if we can make use of commercial cloud services. EMBL, the European Biomolecular Laboratory, which is sort of Europe's leading laboratory in terms of life sciences, they're doing genome analysis on the next generation genome analysis on this infrastructure as well. And the European Space Agency are working with national space agencies, DLR, CNES, CNR as well, to put together an Earth observation platform. So these are flagships that we're putting together to try and use commercial cloud services coming from a whole body of different companies across Europe. And very much from us, from a public organization point of view, what we're trying to do is create an open cloud computing market Think of it from CERN's point of view, right? We have to go through a public tendering process, just like your government agencies do as well. We cannot go and tender for something that only can come from one company, right? So we want to make sure there's a market there in Europe, across our member states, where we can go and tender and get enough bids coming back that there's enough capacity and functionality and scale that we can actually start adding in these resources into the LHC computing model that I showed you earlier. If you want to know more about that, you can look at that stuff online. And this is sort of the way we're doing that at the moment. We did the setup in 2011. We wrote the basic outline model of what we want to try and do. Currently, we're deploying those 3 flagships from CERN, EMBL, and ESA on different providers. We're working with a small company called Cloud Sigma in Switzerland, T-Systems, Deutsche Telekom in Germany, data centers in Germany, and also Atos Systems. Atos Systems, also very well known, Atos Origin. Their major center is, headquarters are in France, but they have major centers here in Barcelona as well. We're working with those guys to try and do the deployment of these things, understanding if the functionality we can get out of these commercial cloud computing services are good enough for us, trying to build up some potential success stories, and then hopefully if that proves to be successful, move on to this idea of a full market in the future, where we can go and tender in that market for the computing resources we need. And the sort of things that we're looking at in that sort of piloting phase is the whole question of security. I mentioned to you the idea at the moment that we have this public key infrastructure, X509-based system, allowing access to all these centers around the world. Can we do that? Is there a federated identity management system in these cloud service providers? Does it guarantee that we can restrict access to the data as well? Remember, we're worried about the physics in the CERN part. From EMBL, the data they have may have ethical issues as well. You might have patient data there as well. We have to be certain about the security aspects there. ESA, the data they have is often politically important, sensitive, but also of great economic value. You'll be surprised, but insurance companies are very interested in getting access to ESA maps to know how much they're going to charge you according to your house insurance. Those sort of questions, right? Reliability. Are these systems as reliable as they claim? We hear about outages and so on. All data centers have outages, but can we put together a system that has the level of reliability and availability that we need? And the question of data privacy that I've mentioned earlier. Scalability, elasticity. Can you really just on demand request another 1,000 nodes? Difficult to imagine how that's provisioned at times, but is it possible? And of course, the networking performance. We have high network accessibility needs. Can the data centers provide us that throughput? Can we get the data in and out of those data centers quick enough? And then the integration. We are not going to give up our own data centers. Not all our applications are going to be able to move out into these commercial cloud services. So how do we marry the two things together? How do we have in-house public-sponsored resources and commercial exterior resources as well, and bring them together in a hybrid model? Of course, we want to avoid vendor lock-in in terms of APIs and so on. If one company goes bust, we have to be able to move the data around to other places without using too much effort, reprogramming effort and so on. And then there are legal concerns. Who has liability if the system fails? Is it us? Is it data system providers? What's the jurisdiction? CERN as an international organization is not bound to any national laws. We have an international policy and jurisdiction. What happens if the laws of a particular country say that they must provide data to third parties? One has to be careful of these questions, right? Same thing for intellectual property rights. We have to make sure that the data and the value around the data is retained by the research organizations. When you upload your material to Facebook, you no longer own it. We can't do that with publicly sponsored data, right? And of course, the whole question of transparency in terms of terms and conditions. How do you get out? And things like that. Okay. So just say what I think will change, looking at those points, what will change in the next few coming years. So first of all, I think there is going to be a massive adoption of virtualization techniques by e-science, let's call them that, e-science, data-intensive science centers, because we see that as a good way of reducing operational costs. That's quite clear. And as I said, it's one thing we want to see with our data processing model to reduce the costs. And also, it does help us simplify the deployment of the applications when we have images. What formats to use for images? What APIs do we use around those for provisioning? That's open for discussion. But again, we want to avoid vendor lock-in and things like that. And also, we've written a lot of middleware, the glue that holds all these data centers together. Can we remove that? Can we remove the manpower and the effort that has to go into that as well? Can that be shipped out to industry and they somehow have a good business model around that and make it work? That'd be very good for us too. And then, as I said, Federated identity management systems, our X509-based systems, are not picked up in the commercial world. You find things like In Common in the US and shibboleth-based technologies and things like that. Is that appropriate? We have to worry about the levels of assurance. We're not going to let you at the moment use your Gmail account to authenticate and operate the LHC. How are we going to do that in the future, right? Okay. Grid extensions. I say this as grid extensions to cloud because we think we've got some things of the grid environment which don't exist in the cloud environment at the moment. This federated identity, the support for virtual organizations. How do you link together people in an experiment that are working together? Somebody's making use of resources from this company, and that company, and they're working in different universities, laboratories. How do you link it all together so they can share the code, they can share the data around those things as well? And then, of course, you know, as I said, this extension of commercial cloud services as, at the moment, I think it's going to start off as a sort of burst approach, additional capacity as the first wave of usage. Afterwards, it may change. It may become an inherent and basic part of the underlying infrastructure. And of course, as well, a blurring of the borders that's happened in Europe at the moment. We have separate infrastructures for networking, separate infrastructures for grid, and separate infrastructure for supercomputing. Think about the Xeon project, EGI project, and think of PRACE, right? We have to bring those together. From a user point of view, they don't give a damn how you separate it, right? They want to see the whole thing working together. They want to be able to have workflows that go across supercomputer centers sitting in Munich against commodity systems sitting in Paris with data structures that are being built up in Helsinki. So how do you do those things together, right? And of course, that's very important because the funding agencies are demanding it. Many of the national funding agencies now are saying, we're not going to give you money now for your faculty computer center. We're going to give you credits on some commercial service or something like that, or to some other center. So we have to be able to take that into account in our future model, right? And I also think there's going to be more of an emergence of the data infrastructure. And that's one of the things we're looking at in Helix Nebula as well. Could you imagine that all the LHC data, all the ESA data, and all the EMBL data is available in some cloud environment for anybody to access it, and then that you can have other layered services coming from companies and so on built on top of it to advance the analysis of that data and the use of it. There's lots of ideas of when you can link those different data sets together, what could come out of that. Okay, so I'll finish there, and thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bob. We still have 10 minutes. If any of you dare ask a question, it's a bit overwhelming. Do we have anybody from the audience who'd like to ask Bob a question? Please.
Sure. No, I really appreciate this, and I really appreciate your focus on the data and the inherent problems in it. I think there's tremendous opportunity for application out beyond that. My question is, how do you bring the people together? Because people are associated with these collaborations, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and CERN's been the focus of a lot of studies on this subject as well. And I think there's a number of important points in the culture around CERN which helps make that possible. The first thing is its multinational status means that when people come into CERN, they leave their nationality behind them. So we have all nationalities working alongside, and so national aspects are not brought through into the scientific approach that works there. And at CERN as well, the science and the finance are completely separated. For example, in the financial model, because it's based on GDP, Germany is the biggest contributor. Understandable, right? But when it comes to the science policy, one country, one vote. Okay? So that's accepted as general policy. The other thing is, it's not only an academic exercise, right? There is an engineering feat that lies below all of this. And that's very good at focusing people's minds and attention. The underlying goal for everybody is to make that machine work. And nothing else counts, is to make the machine work. And they will drop other aspects of hindrances to that in order to make that happen. Let me give you an example. When the LHC started, I think I counted around my own corridor about 4 or 5 camp beds that were in there on the first night when it was coming online, because people were coming in and sleeping in there to make sure that they would be there and if anything went wrong and the thing was working correctly. So there's a great encouragement there of bringing it together. I think it's also linked to the idea that this is the openness. We have no secrets. We have no trade secrets at CERN. There is competition between the experiments, and that's a cultural aspect in the sense that each experiment develops its own culture to some extent. And it's linked very much to the scale of them. Atlas, with 3,000 people, has a more developed and formal structure compared to Alice, which is only several hundred. And for me, the big point is there's a difference between in the experiments where the head of the experiment can know everybody by first name, or if it's too large for that to happen. But when you see 3,000 names on there for the experiments like Atlas, you have to remember that everybody can pretty much define what their role is. And most of that, the people on that, are not the people doing the analysis, but it's really the people that have contributed to building the experiment, the different layers in the onion ring and so on. The technology has been brought forward to do that, the integration and all those work. So it's really sort of, I say, it's a singular focus that really helps us to keep those people together.
Additional questions?
Yeah, this one down here.
You talked about the large amount of electrical power you need for the data centers. Is CERN concerned with the carbon footprint of their operation?
Yeah, we are indeed. So we recycle quite a lot of the sort of the heat that comes out of the data center and from the accelerator, because the data center is a lot smaller than the what's consumed for the accelerator. But for example, there's some very nice tomatoes around the CERN area because we're using the water, the heat to heat up the greenhouses of the local farmers and things like that. So that is important for us. We do a number of things like that. In terms of the actual environmental impact of our infrastructure as well, we look very much at those points. We're working with a number of other research infrastructures in Europe to see what we can do to improve the energy efficiency of these infrastructures, the magnets and so on as well. Yeah.
The fantastic amounts and speeds of data processing and transmission. Once we used to talk about real-time computing. This is a completely different notion of real-time. Where today is the bottleneck of technological production and transmission?
That's a very good question. It's one of the things we're looking at inside the Open Lab with the relationship with industry. And one of the good questions that we got around at the moment was I said to put these things in place, you have to design them several years in advance. They have to be brought into place. The scale of the amount of equipment we're talking about, you have to go through the procurement processes and put it into place. So you can't just change quickly how it happens, and you have to have several generations of the equipment going through. But the major shutdowns, when we have to upgrade the accelerator and upgrade the detectors, so there's one going to happen in 2014 and another major one in 2018. Those are opportunities for us to change technologies and change processes. So, for example, with Oracle and Intel, we sat down and asked the open question. Imagine you had infinite compute capacity at the data centers, at the experiment site. What would change? Now, we taught that to the guys who are doing the operational aspects as well. And of course, these are sort of battle-hardened guys who have been running the thing for a couple of years. And they said for them, what we give them far more opportunities in terms of what they call the trigger menus. What are the different fields of physics that you can look at? So having infinite compute capacity would help them in that way. But again, they're limited by energy. How much electricity can you get into that one site? So we're talking a lot to Intel and these other guys about exascale computing, right? Can we build an exascale computer today? No, because you wouldn't have enough electricity to put it in a single room, all right? But we're looking at silicon photonics in terms of what electronics we would use at the front end to replace the field programmable gate arrays, which are the basis of the trigger one, level one triggers, to see if we can change that, where we now have silicon photonics, where you actually have the fiber optics coming straight onto the chip, all right? So now we have a situation where what I showed you in that graphic of cutting out so much more of the data, it means that we have more capacity, we can do more analysis on the event at each level of that triggering. So having massive compute capacity there means that we can expand the physics. Of course, the other aspect we're looking at is the whole area of the data storage. At the moment, our data are stored in flat files. We have a popular analysis framework called Root, which works on flat files and looks at the event structure inside those. But the metadata for all the physics is actually stored in an Oracle database, in a relational database, right? But not the data itself, because putting 22 petabytes per year is a bit awkward, right? But we're looking at, imagine you could, with the latest things we're looking at with Weiwei and these other things, imagine now you have a Hadoop or Cloudera cluster that's infinite again in terms of your storage. It's telling me I should stop talking. There's an infinite capacity there. How can we change the relationships between the data? There's a lot of things looking at now. All our systems are POSIX-based systems. And it's been very good POSIX in terms of bringing us through the generations of technology we've been using at the moment. But we also give up a lot because of POSIX. The extra constraints to have POSIX compatibility puts additional constraints on how you can build the architecture. If we have a relaxed attitude to POSIX, not trying to adhere to all the POSIX standards, we can change our data management standards about how many copies you have to store of the data on disks so you don't avoid losing the data and so on, the relationships, the positioning of those things. So I think we can become a lot more efficient and also a lot more scalable. So we could potentially have more compute capacity with what we're doing with Intel and potentially new ideas about how we can access larger data stores looking at this relaxed POSIX approach to storage as well.